High in the mountains, there was a monastery where the monks swore to never speak, eat, or even breathe out of rhythm. Villagers noticed first. Snow fell without a whisper, birds froze mid-flight, and streams ran silent. Inside, the brothers' mouths were stuffed with cloth, their ears packed with wax, walls carved with the same word over and over, noise. When the monastery finally collapsed, silence did not die. It learned to move, to wait, to hunt, and now, sometimes at night, the valley goes utterly mute, and people feel it passing through their homes, like a held breath pressing against their skulls. The first thing the villagers noticed was the sound that did not exist. High above the valley, where wind usually scraped stone and bells carried for miles, the monastery sat wrapped in an unnatural hush. Snow fell without whisper, birds veered away mid-flight, and even avalanches farther up the slopes seemed to break before reaching its walls. Travelers who passed too close reported pressure behind the eyes, as if the air itself were being compressed and swallowed. The brothers inside called this holiness. The valley called it wrong. The monastery clung to the mountainside like a wound that refused to close. Its stone walls were pale and narrow-windowed, drinking in light without reflecting it, as if brightness itself hesitated to touch the place. Paths leading upward narrowed the closer they came, not by design but by use, worn thin by generations who stopped visiting sooner each year. Goats refused to climb the final stretch. Dogs lay down and trembled when dragged toward the gate. Even the bells in nearby villages seemed to dull when the wind turned toward the heights, their notes flattening and dying early. No bell ever rang from the monastery itself. It had been built that way deliberately, founded by an order that believed sound was the first corruption of the soul. Their rule demanded silence not as discipline, but as consumption. Silence was to be taken in, swallowed, allowed to fill the body until nothing else remained. The brothers arrived healthy, loud in their habits without realizing it, boots heavy on stone, breath still rhythmic with the world below. Within months their steps softened. Within years, they moved like shadows, mouths slack, eyes alert in a way that suggested constant listening. From the valley, people could feel the monastery more than see it. On certain mornings the air grew thick and resistant, as if sound itself had weight and had settled downhill overnight. Woodcutters complained that axes struck deeper than expected, the impact oddly muffled. Milk soured faster. Infants cried until exhaustion and then fell silent in a way that frightened their mothers more than screaming ever could. The elders spoke of pressure, of headaches that bloomed when clouds hid the peak, of dreams where they stood in empty rooms that pressed inward from every side. Inside the walls, the brothers recorded nothing aloud. Their chronicles were thin and careful, written sparsely, each word rationed like food. Early pages spoke of peace, of clarity, of minds emptied and cleansed. Later entries shortened. Lines broke apart. Margins filled with erratic marks, scratches where ink had been dragged hard enough to tear parchment. The monastery did not echo. Sound entered and did not return. Prayers vanished into stone. Breathing felt intrusive, like a noise that did not belong. The valley watched, uneasy but distant. The monastery asked for little, sent no messengers, demanded no offerings. Its silence was self-contained, or so it seemed. Yet year by year, the hush spread. It crept downhill with the snowmelt, settled into forests, pooled in barns at night. And still, high above it all, the monastery remained perfectly still, as if listening, waiting, and slowly learning how much the world could endure before it noticed what was being taken. The monastery had been founded in the middle of the 15th century by an order obsessed with purity through absence. Absence of speech, absence of music, absence of confession spoken aloud. They believed sound was not merely distraction but contamination, a residue of the outer world that clung to thought and distorted it. To cleanse the soul, they reasoned, one must starve it of noise until only truth remained. Their rule demanded absolute silence, not only of mouth but of gesture, habit, and thought as much as thought could be controlled. Words were forbidden, but so were unnecessary movements. A nod held too much intention. A sigh was a failure. Even the rhythm of breathing was trained, slowed, flattened into something nearly mechanical. The monastery's architecture reflected this belief. Corridors were long and narrow, designed to swallow footsteps. Walls were thick enough that rooms did not share sound, only weight. Doors closed without creak, hinges packed with grease and cloth. Floors were laid with stone chosen not for beauty but for dullness, surfaces that absorbed impact instead of returning it. The refectory benches were worn smooth by generations of bodies shifting carefully, terrified of noise they could not hear themselves make. The silence inside the walls was not empty. It was cultivated, layered, enforced until it became a substance the brothers moved through daily. They ate in silence, heads bowed, mouths opening and closing with deliberate restraint. Food was chosen for texture rather than taste, soft enough not to crunch, thin enough not to demand effort. They prayed in silence, lips still, eyes fixed, minds trained to circle inward without forming sound. They labored in silence, so complete that even coughing was punished with days alone in stone cells carved directly into the mountain. These cells had no windows, no furnishings, no relief from pressure. Brothers emerged from them pale and shaking, yet often grateful, convinced the punishment had scraped something away they no longer needed. At first, the order was admired. Pilgrims spoke of discipline so pure it bordered on the miraculous. Nobles sent sons who talked too much, who laughed too freely, who needed correction beyond ordinary instruction. The valley benefited quietly. The monastery bought supplies, employed carriers, and asked nothing in return. It was self-contained, efficient, and devout. Silence, it seemed, made men orderly. Then the rumors began. A shepherd found one of the brothers wandering into fresh snow at dawn, barefoot and unresponsive, toes already blue, eyes unfocused but alert. When led back toward the monastery, the man resisted without struggle, body heavy and uncooperative, as if being pulled against a current no one else could feel. Another brother was seen kneeling in the courtyard long after prayers had ended, mouth stretched into a grin that did not match his eyes, which darted and twitched as if tracking movement no one else could see. He remained there until nightfall, unmoving, snow collecting on his shoulders without reaction. Inside the walls, habits changed subtly. Brothers began to move their hands at night, tapping walls in frantic, rhythmic patterns, knuckles bruised and split by morning. The tapping followed no prayer, no known cadence. It was irregular, desperate, accelerating until exhaustion forced stillness. Others pressed their ears to stone floors or leaned into corners where walls met, as if listening for something trapped beneath layers of rock. When questioned through written reprimands, they responded with blank pages or repeated the same single line until ink bled through parchment. The order's leadership dismissed these signs as growing pains of devotion. Silence, they insisted, stripped away weakness before revealing clarity. What they did not acknowledge was the change in the monastery itself. The hush within its walls had thickened. It no longer dissipated when doors opened. It clung to fabric, to skin, to breath. Brothers who traveled down the mountain for supplies returned altered, moving too carefully, eyes strained, mouths tight, as if holding something in. They brought the silence back with them, deepening it further, feeding the very thing they believed they were mastering. Physical symptoms followed. Ears bled without injury. Gums receded and split. Hands shook when idle, fingers curling inward as if grasping for form. Sleep became erratic and shallow. Dreams were heavy, filled with pressure and enclosure, of rooms narrowing inch by inch, of air growing dense enough to resist breath. Some brothers woke with the certainty that they had been screaming, though no sound lingered in memory or space. Others woke convinced they had heard something for the first time in years, only to realize the sensation was internal, a vibration with no source. The monastery's records reflected this decay. Early chronicles were neat and sparse, documenting seasons, harvests, repairs. Later pages grew crowded, margins filled with symbols that repeated without explanation. Lines broke mid-thought. Ink blots clustered where hands had paused too long, hovering, trembling. One ledger recorded the same date again and again, written dozens of times across different pages, as if time itself had stalled within the walls. Another replaced words entirely with pressure marks, the stylus driven so hard it scarred the surface beneath. Punishments increased as discipline frayed. Silence violations multiplied, though no one could say what noise had been made. Brothers were confined to cells for offenses they did not understand, emerging days later hollow-eyed, jaws clenched so tightly teeth cracked. Confession by writing became erratic, filled with references to weight, to fullness, to an internal roar that could not be released. The leadership interpreted this as resistance, a failure of will, and tightened the rule further, reducing food, shortening rest, extending isolation. The valley felt the change as well. Bells rang flatter. Wind lost its edge. Sound seemed to die sooner than it should, smothered by distance that had not changed. People complained of headaches when clouds settled low over the peak. Livestock grew skittish, refusing shelters nearest the mountain. Infants fell into long, breathless silences that ended in sudden, violent crying. The monastery did not respond to these concerns. Its gates remained closed, its silence absolute. Within the walls, the brothers no longer seemed to be practicing absence. They were being consumed by it. Silence was no longer something they maintained. It was something that pressed back, that demanded attention, that punished neglect. The tapping at night grew louder in frequency, if not in sound. Walls bore marks from fingers dragged repeatedly along the same grooves. The refectory floor grew polished in irregular paths where brothers paced without realizing they were moving. By the end of the decade, admiration had curdled into fear. The monastery still stood, immaculate and still, but those who glimpsed its inhabitants no longer saw men pursuing holiness. They saw figures hollowed out by something they had invited inside, something that did not speak, did not sing, did not announce itself, something that listened endlessly, patiently, growing stronger the longer it was fed. As years passed, the monastery's silence thickened. It no longer behaved like an absence that could be ignored, stepped around, or filled with effort. It became a substance that settled into rooms and pressed into lungs, changing how bodies moved and how minds arranged themselves. Candles burned without flicker even when doors opened, their flames standing straight and rigid as if pinned in place. Dust fell in slow, deliberate lines and did not scatter. Footsteps felt intrusive, like violations against something alert and easily offended. The brothers learned to place their feet carefully, lowering weight in measured increments, as though the floor itself might recoil if struck too hard. Breathing became conscious labor. Inhalations felt thick, resistant, as if the air needed convincing to enter the chest. Exhalations left nothing behind, no warmth, no sound, no sense of release. The monks began to breathe shallowly, not from instruction but instinct, their ribcages barely moving beneath coarse habits. At night the dormitories filled with the faint, synchronized motion of restrained lungs, rows of bodies rising and falling like a single organism afraid of waking itself. The first symptoms were dismissed as weakness. A brother complained of ringing in his ears despite the absence of sound, a high internal whine that swelled during prayers and faded only with exhaustion. Another woke with blood along his gums, teeth loosened as if they had been clenched against pressure for hours. Fingers trembled without cold, hands curling inward, nails digging crescents into palms. These were recorded as trials, expected fractures along the path to purification. Silence, the rule taught, stripped the soul. Pain was simply the sound of impurity leaving the body. But the symptoms spread with unsettling consistency. Men of different ages and origins began to mirror one another. They bled in the same places. Their hands shook at the same hours. They woke from rest at the same moments, gasping without having dreamed. Several developed an unspoken habit of touching their throats, pressing gently at first, then harder, as if checking whether something inside had shifted position. Marks appeared along necks, not bruises but reddened impressions where fingers lingered too long. The wood of the monastery began to change as well. Benches bore grooves that had not been carved by tools. Prayer stalls accumulated scratches along the inner panels, thin lines at first, then deeper channels where nails had been dragged repeatedly. One brother wore down his fingertips to raw flesh without noticing, continuing to scrape the same wordless patterns into the surface until bone showed white beneath torn skin. He did not cry out. He did not stop. When discovered, he stood calmly beside his work, eyes unfocused, hands held away from his body as if they no longer belonged to him. Others developed a different response. During prayers, they lowered themselves to the stone floor and pressed their ears against it, faces contorted with concentration. They remained there long after the rest had risen, cheekbones aching, ears reddened and swollen. When pulled away, they resisted with surprising strength, fingers clawing at mortar, bodies tensing as though separated from a source of nourishment. The stone was cool and smooth where they pressed, worn in shallow hollows shaped unmistakably like heads. The abbot observed all of this and wrote tirelessly. His role demanded interpretation, and so he interpreted until meaning blurred into justification. Each incident became a lesson, each injury a sign of progress. His manuscripts expanded even as coherence failed. Early entries retained structure, careful letters aligned along margins, scriptures cited precisely. Later pages grew crowded. Ink pooled where the quill paused too long. Lines curved and doubled back on themselves. Margins filled with spirals, tight at first, then widening into erratic loops that pressed against the text until both dissolved into noise. Words repeated without intention. Phrases broke apart mid-sentence and resumed pages later with no acknowledgement of interruption. At times the abbot scratched out entire sections so aggressively that parchment tore, leaving ragged holes surrounded by dark stains. He began to favor certain symbols, drawing them again and again without explanation. They resembled neither letters nor numbers, but compressed shapes, mouths opened wide or ears drawn impossibly large. He did not notice the repetition. He did not notice much at all. Meals grew shorter. Chewing felt loud, obscene in the refectory's dense quiet. Brothers swallowed food barely broken down, wincing at the internal sounds of digestion that seemed amplified inside their bodies. Some developed sores in their mouths from holding tongues rigid, afraid of the wet noises that movement produced. Others starved themselves subtly, pushing portions aside grain by grain, preferring the ache of hunger to the perceived offense of swallowing. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams flattened, stripped of imagery, reduced to sensations of compression and enclosure. Brothers woke convinced the walls had moved closer during the night, that the ceiling had lowered by inches, that space itself was shrinking. Several were found sleeping upright against walls, foreheads pressed to stone, breathing shallow and fast. Their beds remained untouched, blankets neatly folded as if ritual could not coexist with rest. Time inside the monastery began to behave strangely. Days blurred together without the punctuation of sound. Bells did not mark hours. Voices did not separate moments. Brothers lost track of sequence, repeating tasks they had already completed, neglecting others entirely. A monk assigned to tend candles replaced wicks that were still new, over and over, until his fingers blackened with soot. Another scrubbed the same patch of floor for days, erasing nothing, wearing stone smooth beneath his hands. Outside, the valley felt the change more clearly. The silence that had once clung to the monastery now rolled outward in slow waves. Shepherds noticed stretches of pasture where wind died abruptly, grass standing still while surrounding fields rippled. Hunters reported shots that sounded muffled even at the barrel, recoil felt without the expected crack. At night, the mountains held on to noise as if refusing to release it, creating pockets of dead air where even breathing felt loud. Within the walls, the brothers stopped writing altogether. Parchment lay untouched, not from discipline, but from an inability to decide what belonged on it. Thoughts arrived without edges, impressions without language. When some attempted to write, they froze, quills hovering above the page, hands trembling as if awaiting permission from something unseen. Others filled sheets rapidly with meaningless marks, lines intersecting and collapsing into dense black fields that absorbed light. The abbot's final entries were nearly illegible. Ink had been applied so heavily that pages stuck together, torn apart only with effort. Between layers of blot and smear, fragments emerged. Not sentences, not prayers, but clusters of the same word repeated obsessively, sometimes written small and precise, sometimes gouged into the page with violent pressure. The word shifted in spelling, in form, in orientation, but its intent felt unmistakable. It was not a request. It was a diagnosis. By the time the monastery was noticed again by the world beyond the valley, silence had completed its work. It no longer waited to be obeyed. It acted. It pressed. It consumed. It reshaped those who had offered themselves to it willingly. The brothers had sought purity through absence. What they found instead was presence without mercy, a force that did not merely remove sound, but replaced it with something that learned their limits and pushed until nothing remained to resist. The collapse came quietly, without omen or announcement, as if silence itself had finally finished its work and no longer required witnesses. In the deepest part of winter, the supply carts failed to return. At first, this was not alarming. Snow closed passes every year, and the monastery had always demanded little. Weeks passed, then months. No request came down the mountain. No scraps of parchment, no sign pressed into wax, no novice sent stumbling into the valley for grain or oil. The road remained untouched, its surface smoothing under snow and wind until it looked less like a path and more like a scar that had healed over. Spring arrived reluctantly, light returning to the slopes in thin, pale bands. From below, the monastery showed no change. No smoke rose from its chimneys. No figures crossed the inner yard. No bell announced the hours, as there had never been a bell. What unsettled the valley was not absence of activity, but its completeness. Even ruins showed signs of collapse. Even abandonment made noise. This place offered nothing. It sat as it always had, intact, sealed, unnaturally finished. Church authorities were notified and delayed their response, unwilling to approach a place already burdened with rumor. When they finally arrived, their ascent was marked by unease rather than resistance. The doors were not barred. Locks had not been forced. The wood opened inward with a soft pressure, as though the building itself had been waiting to be entered. Inside, the air was stale but not rotten, cool and dense, carrying the faint scent of wax and old stone. Sound did not travel. Footsteps landed and died where they fell. The monastery was whole. Beds were made. Tools lay where they had last been set down. Meals had been prepared and left untouched, bread hardened into shapes that still remembered hands. Bodies were present in almost every cell, arranged not in collapse, but in posture. Brothers sat upright against walls, legs folded neatly, heads inclined in attitudes that resembled prayer until examined closely. Their mouths were packed with cloth torn from habits, shoved deep enough to stretch lips and tear skin. Ears were sealed with wax, darkened with blood, pressed in until the canals were ruined. Eyes were open or closed without pattern, some calm, some wide and strained, as if fixed on something just beyond reach. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken doors. The violence had been inward, meticulous, deliberate. Fingernails were worn to stumps. Some fingers ended in raw bone, the nails having been torn away through repeated scraping. On wooden surfaces, words had been carved with desperate care. On stone, they had been scratched until the surface gave way. Ink covered walls in layers, blotted and smeared, overlapping itself until individual hands were impossible to distinguish. It was not prayer. It was not confession. It was repetition. The same word, again and again, etched at different heights, in different sizes, some precise, others collapsing into jagged lines as control failed. Noise. The deeper the authorities moved into the monastery, the heavier the pressure became. Breathing required effort. Lantern flames burned steady, refusing to flicker even when moved quickly. Sound felt invasive, like a violation of rules still in force. The men spoke in whispers out of instinct, then stopped speaking altogether when even that felt wrong. Their ears rang faintly, though no sound accompanied the sensation. It was as if the building remembered what it had been designed to contain and resisted change. The underground refectory held the worst of it. The stairs leading down were worn smooth by countless silent processions, their edges rounded by time and habit. At the bottom, the space opened wide and low, its ceiling supported by thick stone pillars that drank in light. Tables stood in place, bare and clean, their surfaces marked only by shallow grooves where bowls had once rested. Between the stones of the walls, hundreds of folded notes had been pressed, wedged into cracks with fingers that must have bled to fit them in. They were stacked in piles, arranged in lines, scattered where hands had failed to finish the task. Each bore the same single word, written carefully, written shakily, written so deeply the parchment tore. Noise. The handwriting varied wildly. Some hands were educated, controlled, the letters balanced and even. Others shook violently, lines wandering, ink pooling where the pen had stalled. Some notes were stained dark, not with ink alone. The repetition suggested obsession, but the volume suggested necessity. This was not expression. It was accumulation. The refectory felt full in a way no room filled with objects ever could. The air pressed back against the chest. Several of the men felt an urge to cover their mouths, to hum, to cough, to break the stillness in some small way just to feel their bodies respond. Records were found in the abbot's chamber, though they barely qualified as such. Early entries spoke of discipline and clarity, of brothers achieving a higher state through deprivation. Later pages grew disordered, sentences fractured, words repeated without conclusion, margins filled with spirals, tight and relentless, circling nothing. Ink was dragged across pages in heavy strokes, pressed hard enough to emboss the parchment beneath. The final entries abandoned language entirely, replaced by dense fields of lines that overlapped and canceled each other out. The hand that made them had not been seeking meaning. It had been seeking relief. The official report described starvation and madness, the known consequences of isolation and extreme asceticism. It catalogued the dead, sealed the buildings, and ordered the site abandoned. The monastery was declared a failure of excess rather than absence, its silence reframed as negligence rather than intent. But the men who left carried the experience with them. For days afterward, they reported headaches that no medicine touched, a sense of fullness behind the eyes, a lingering urge to make noise at inappropriate moments. One woke screaming in the night, convinced his lungs were collapsing inward. Another refused to enter churches, claiming the quiet pressed too hard on his chest. The valley watched the authorities descend and felt no relief. The mountain did not release its hold. The hush remained, thinner now but spread wider, drifting into forests and fields. People spoke louder to compensate, laughed too sharply, filled their homes with sound until walls vibrated. It helped, briefly. Then the pressure returned, subtle and patient. The monastery was sealed, but silence does not respect stone. It had been fed for years, trained, taught to move inward and stay. Now, with nothing left to consume inside those walls, it began to wander. And those who understood what had happened understood something else as well. The brothers had not gone mad from lack of sound. They had discovered what lived beneath it, and it had learned how to leave. The official explanation blamed starvation, isolation, the known dangers of extreme asceticism. The reports were clean, measured, and mercifully dull. Ink dried over conclusions that required no further inspection, and seals were pressed with practiced relief. The monastery was declared unfit, its order dissolved without ceremony, its surviving records archived and forgotten. The valley exhaled. Sound returned in cautious increments, first as wind threading through trees, then as water breaking stone, then as bells daring to ring fully again. Life resumed its familiar abrasions. For a time, the world felt restored. Years passed. Moss crept over the monastery walls, stitching cracks shut with green patience. Snow reclaimed the paths, erasing the last thin lines of human use. Shepherds learned new routes. Children grew without stories of the place, warned only to keep their distance from the ruins for reasons no one quite remembered. The hush thinned. It did not vanish, but it learned to hide among ordinary silences. When storms broke high on the slopes, they sounded like storms again. When birds crossed the ridge, they sang. The mountain appeared healed. The decision to dismantle the lower structures came quietly, justified by practical need. Stone was scarce, and the monastery sat unused, its foundations sound. Workers were sent up in summer, men accustomed to altitude and long days. They brought tools, carts, and the unthinking confidence of those who believe danger announces itself. The first weeks passed without incident. Walls came down stone by stone, each impact ringing sharp and clean, sound bouncing freely where it once would have died. Dust rose and settled. The air tasted of lime and age. Then the refectory floor resisted. It was not the stone itself, which fractured easily under iron, but the way it refused alignment. Lines that should have met did not. Measurements drifted by inches that could not be explained by wear or subsidence. When the final slab lifted, it revealed a void that had not been drawn on any plan. The opening breathed cold. Tools left at its edge hummed faintly. A vibration felt more than heard. Men leaned close and pulled back with aching teeth, pressing tongues to gums as if checking for blood. The chamber below was wrong in its proportions. It did not sit square to the refectory above, nor to the mountain that held it. Its walls curved subtly inward, enough to be felt when standing still, as if balance itself required adjustment. Lantern light slid across stone that did not glitter or absorb but dulled, its surface polished smooth by contact rather than craft. There were no chisel marks, no seams. The floor was worn into shallow depressions where bodies might have knelt or lain, not arranged with intention but with repetition. The air inside vibrated faintly, a low pressure that made jaws ache and eyes water. Breath felt intrusive, as though it displaced something already present. Men spoke less without agreeing to. Footsteps softened. The sound of a dropped tool arrived late, flattened, robbed of its beginning and end. One worker pressed his palm to the wall and withdrew it quickly, skin reddened as if rubbed too long against coarse cloth. Another laughed once, sharply, and then did not again. Scraped into the stone were grooves. They layered over one another in densities too deep to count, lines intersecting and diverging, widened by time and touch. They were not random. Each groove curved in the same direction, opening, stretching, repeating. When seen at a distance, they resembled waves or leaves. Up close, they resolved into mouths. Wide, straining mouths pressed against stone, lips implied by smooth arcs, corners dug deeper where effort had concentrated. There were no teeth carved, no tongues, only the negative space of desire, of opening without release. The workers did not linger. They marked the chamber and withdrew, hands shaking despite the warmth. Above ground, the mountain resumed its ordinary noises. Birds sang, carts creaked. But the refectory floor no longer sat quietly. At night, those camped nearby felt pressure behind the eyes, a familiar weight that returned without permission. Dreams came crowded and airless. Waking brought no relief. The valley below experienced small disturbances. Wells tasted flat. Milk curdled without heat. Dogs refused certain paths again, remembering what people had tried to forget. Church officials arrived days later, accompanied by scholars and men tasked with containment rather than understanding. The chamber was inspected, measured, sketched, and deemed an anomaly of unknown origin. The grooves were attributed to devotional excess, the polish to centuries of use. Words were chosen carefully, their edges sanded smooth. A decision was made to seal the space permanently. Rubble was brought, mortar mixed thick. The opening was filled layer by layer, stone packed tight, air forced out with effort. As the chamber closed, the vibration changed. It did not stop. It condensed. Those present felt it in their teeth, a tightening that crawled along bone and settled behind the eyes. Mortar cured too fast, cracking as it dried. When the last stone was set, silence returned in a form that felt heavier than before, not spreading but concentrating. The refectory floor lay flat again, unremarkable to the eye, but the pressure remained beneath it, patient and intact. Records of the chamber were filed separately, then lost among inventories and repairs. The official story held. The monastery was dismantled. Stone traveled downhill to become walls and barns and hearths. Sound followed, clinging to its new homes. Children laughed against stones that had once learned to swallow noise. Fires crackled. Hammers rang. Life pressed forward. Yet certain buildings developed habits. Rooms where speech felt difficult. Corners where sound thinned unexpectedly. People found themselves whispering without reason, then forcing their voices loud in reaction, as if afraid of being overheard by absence. At night, Some woke with sore jaws and the sense that they had been holding their mouths open for hours, straining towards something just out of reach. The mountain did not correct this. Weather came and went. Snow buried and revealed the ruins and cycles that felt ordinary. The sealed chamber did not announce itself. It did not need to. It had learned what it required long before the walls above it were ever raised. The monks had given it years of practice, a discipline of attention, a diet of denial. They had taught silence how to shape itself, how to press and be pressed, how to endure without moving. What remained beneath the refectory floor was not a room. It was a memory with weight, a pressure that did not dissipate when ignored. Sealed stone did not starve it. It simply forced it to wait, listening without ears, opening without mouths, patient as the mountain itself, confident that the world above would, in time, remember how to feed it. The workers fled with their tools abandoned where they fell, iron clattering down stone steps and disappearing into the dark like swallowed sounds. No one tried to stop them. The chamber beneath the refectory was filled in quickly and without ceremony. Rubble tipped into the opening until stone ground against stone and the faint vibration vanished beneath weight. The entrance was sealed with mortar mixed too thin, as if haste mattered more than strength. The monastery itself was left to rot into the mountainside, its roof sagging under snow, its walls slowly taken back by lichen and ice. From a distance it appeared harmless again, just another ruin clinging to rock. The valley believed the danger had been buried. It had not been destroyed. It had only been redirected. At first the changes were subtle enough to dismiss. A night would pass strangely quiet, so still that even seasoned shepherds woke uneasy, convinced something had gone wrong with their hearing. Insects froze mid-song, crickets caught with legs lifted, wings half open, their silence unnerving in its precision. Streams continued to move, but made no sound against stone, water sliding like oil through channels it had carved for centuries. People would step outside, clap their hands, stamp their feet, test the world. The sound always returned by morning. The valley laughed it off as weather, as altitude, as nerves remembering old stories they pretended not to believe. But the nights of silence returned. They arrived without pattern, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes consecutive, and each time they lasted longer. When the hush settled, it felt heavier than before, no longer confined to the heights, but resting low among houses and fields. The air resisted movement. Words spoken during those hours felt wrong inside the mouth, thick and slow, as if language itself struggled to exist. Many chose not to speak at all, pressing lips together and waiting it out, afraid that sound might attract attention. Children suffered first. Infants woke screaming and then stopped abruptly, their faces red and strained, lungs empty, as if the act of making noise had been physically interrupted. Older children developed habits that alarmed their parents, humming constantly during the day, tapping tables and walls with relentless rhythm, grinding pebbles together just to hear something answer back. When reprimanded, they grew frantic, eyes wide, hands shaking, unable to explain the fear that silence now triggered in them. Animals followed. Sheep clustered tightly at night, bodies pressed together until breath steamed thick and fast. Dogs refused to leave their owners' sides after sunset, whining softly when the air grew still. Horses bolted from open fields during mute hours, crashing through fences without apparent cause. Birds abandoned familiar nesting grounds and did not return, leaving rafters empty and skies oddly vacant. The ruins of the monastery became a place no one admitted thinking about, yet everyone avoided. Paths that once passed near the slope were rerouted over time, worn into new shapes by careful feet. On nights of complete silence, people swore they could feel a pull from that direction, not strong enough to drag the body, but persistent enough to occupy the mind. It felt like attention, like being noticed. Years passed. Generations changed. The story blurred into folklore, its edges softened for children, sharpened for outsiders. The monastery was blamed for madness, for weather, for misfortune. No one spoke of hunger. That word belonged too closely to the truth. The silence began to behave differently. It no longer arrived all at once. It crept. Sounds dulled in stages, first losing distance, then clarity, then texture. Wind still moved leaves, but without rustle. Doors closed without thud. Footsteps lost their echo. People learned the warning signs instinctively and reacted without instruction. Fires were stoked, tools struck against stone, bells rung until arms ached. Noise became ritual, not communication but defense. Some nights, it was not enough. During one long winter, the valley experienced its first total loss. A hamlet on the eastern edge fell silent at dusk and did not recover by dawn. When people arrived from neighboring farms, they found doors open and hearths cold. Food lay half prepared. Tools rested where they had been dropped. The inhabitants were present in body but gone in every way that mattered. They sat or lay as if paused, eyes open, mouths stuffed with cloth, straw, anything soft enough to block sound from escaping. Ears were packed tight with wax, wool, even mud. Some had clawed at their own faces, leaving red grooves that froze hard in the cold. No struggle had taken place. There were no signs of violence. Only a deliberate, desperate attempt to shut the world out before it could be taken from them. The valley did not recover from that winter. People moved away in slow waves, leaving behind empty houses and fields that returned to scrub. Those who stayed adapted as best they could. They filled their lives with noise, crude and constant. Drums made from barrels. Wind chimes hung in every doorway. Songs repeated endlessly, stripped of meaning but heavy with sound. Sleep became shallow, interrupted by the need to hum, to whisper, to cough just to prove breath still carried weight. The silence responded. It learned to wait. It learned to stretch thin and then snap tight. It learned which hours were weakest, which minds were tired, which houses were quiet out of habit rather than fear. It fed not on absence alone, but on restraint, on the effort of holding noise back when exhaustion made vigilance slip. The monks had believed silence was emptiness, a void to be filled with faith. What they had created instead was appetite. Long after the monastery collapsed entirely, reduced to a smear of stone and moss, the hunger remained anchored to the valley. It no longer needed walls. It no longer needed rules. It had been taught patience, discipline, repetition. It had been fed for decades with devotion and denial, and it had learned how to survive without its original source. On rare nights, when the valley went utterly mute, people claimed they could feel something move through the dark, not a presence with shape, but a pressure that passed from house to house like a held breath. In those moments, everyone understood the same terrible truth without ever speaking it. Sound was not natural. It was a shield, and silence, once starved, did not simply wait to be fed again. It hunted.